Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Two of my favorite subgenres in sci-fi are Afrofuturism and camp. So today we're going to talk a little bit about each of those, including Janelle Monae's emotion picture Dirty Computer. We're going to discuss Clipping's album Splendor and Misery, as well as some camp like Land of the Lost and my personal favorite, The Magicians. I know I say that everything is my favorite, but that's just pretty much because I love all sci-fi and sci-fi adjacent speculative fiction. At the end, we'll go ahead and go over a top five of my favorite camp, sci-fi and other types of speculative fiction. So if you guys haven't seen those yet and you're into camp, then I definitely have some recommendations for you. So to start out, camp is defined in the Cambridge Dictionary as something that is amusing because it is obviously intended to be strange or shocking and seems to be ridiculing itself. Writer and filmmaker Susan Sontag published an essay called Notes on Camp, in which she defines and expounds upon that concept. So camp is not the same thing as cheesy. Camp knows that it's camp, and it is that way intentionally. Susan kind of epitomizes that when she closes the essay by saying, the ultimate camp statement is that it's good because it's awful. Of course, one can't always say that. So when we say awful, we don't really mean awful per se, but it is something that is over the top. It is making fun of the genre itself in some ways, or emphasizing certain components of the genre to an extreme. And one of my favorites for that is The Magicians. Today, we're specifically going to talk about the season 4, episode 10 episode, All That Hard, Glossy Armor. So if you're not familiar with The Magicians, it's based on the books by Lev Grossman. And my favorite character, Margot, is based on a character named Janet in the books and is played by Summer Bishil. So this season 4, episode 10, musical episode, is actually very well written, and unlike most musical episodes in sci-fi and fantasy, like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer musical episode, this isn't played for comedy. This is drama, and it's very interesting to me how Sarah Gamble, who you might recognize her name from Supernatural, and John McNamara, who did Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman with Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher, they wrote and produced this. And they did a fantastic job in writing it. It has a lot of 80s music in this episode, and my favorite one is Don't Get Me Wrong by The Pretenders. Elliot absolutely nails it. And this episode is about Margot's quest to save Elliot from this ancient murder monster that's inhabiting his body. So she has to go and find these axes. She goes on a quest to obtain them from someone, and she essentially ends up licking a lizard for water in the desert and getting high off of that, and then goes on this journey. The lizard takes the form of Elliot singing these songs and ends up, leading her to where she needs to be, where she passes out and then she wakes up, and people who can help her are there. Kind of like when Simba passes out in the desert in The Lion King, when he wakes up, Timon and Pumbaa are there. So that's your episode recap. There's some other stuff going on in the episode with the other characters, but that's neither here nor there for our purposes. A lot of this episode is about Margot's personal journey and her inner growth. So I like that it's very character specific, and in that way kind of follows a lot of TNG episodes. It's partly about being told that you can be anything and then getting backlash when you become it, which I think is pretty relatable for a lot of people. This episode is also about her relationship with her father. And in the episode, she says, "He was the one who told me I could be anything, and I believed him. But he didn't tell me that the world makes you choose. You can be one of the smart ones, or one of the pretty ones, or even a strong one. But try to be all three. You better learn to smile and shut up. Because the second you get too loud, or you get angry, then you're too much for someone." So Margot is kind of an aggressive character. She is very hardcore. She does not pull any punches and is very firm in who she is all throughout the series. But she also has a very sharp edge to her. Margot is aggressive in a proactive way. She's not just reactive aggressive. She is hiding beneath all that hard, glossy armor to prevent people from hurting her. Her thing is, if I hurt you first, you can't get to me. And it's very much a mean girl persona that she really starts out with. But one thing I really like about the Magicians is that they seriously develop these characters as the plot goes on throughout the seasons. And this relationship with Margot's father is where a lot of who she is stems from. So growing up, she was a daddy's girl, and they were best friends. But as she got older and started becoming an adult and fully stepping into herself, he started getting uncomfortable, and his rejection of her was derived from his inability to be comfortable with her becoming a woman, her own person. And I think that's also relatable for a lot of us who used to be children. And as we grow, your relationships with different people change as you become your own person. You're not really becoming someone different. You're just kind of stepping into who you are as you emerge from childhood into adolescence and adulthood. And sometimes people are uncomfortable with that. Sometimes people can't grow along with us. And unfortunately, some other people also can't accept that, or they refuse to accept that. And in this case, it was very hard for her because this person was her father. It wasn't just losing a friend. It was her father absolutely turning his back on her because she grew up to be exactly what he told her she could be. She could be anything, and she was, and then he rejected her for it. So that's why Margot lashes out from beneath that hard, glossy armor. And in this episode, she comes to terms with being herself without carrying that edge that so many of us do carry. She's always known herself. Don't get me wrong. Margot has always been very firm since the first time that you meet her in the show. She's always been very firm, very confident. She knows who she is. She knows what she's capable of. And she's overall a good person. But she, I think, has harbored some guilt and has felt bad about who she is because the one person who told her she could be anything rejected her when she became it. So by the end of this episode, she's no longer feeling bad about who she is, and she doesn't have to be hard on herself anymore. So it's really a reckoning for Margot. And in this way, it's told in an exercise of the Socratic method. So it's a discussion between Margot and her soul through this whole episode as mediated by Elliot and her other friends. So all the other characters appear as this days-long hallucination from licking that lizard. And that includes Dean Fogg, who is representative of wisdom in this point. So Margot is tripping in the desert for, we don't actually know how long, but we know at least 2 nights pass. And she comes across these people who live out in the desert, and they almost kill her at first. But then they see that she's been banned from Fillory by the brand on her arm, and they decide, hey, the enemy of our enemy is our friend, and they let her in. And Margot starts talking to them about those axes, because the guy who's there has them. but he won't give them to her. He tells them they're enchanted only to work for him, and that he can only tell her how to make it. And in order to do so, she has to go and pick out all the little black grains of sand. So out of 100 of them, most of them are white, and every 1 in 100 is going to be black. So she goes and has to fill up this giant bucket with it in order to forge her own. And so she goes out into the desert and has kind of a soul-searching heart-to-heart with herself via these hallucinations. And then she comes out on the other side, having lost that edge and discovered more about herself and why she is the way she is and what she's going to do about that going forward. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more about the Socratic method in storytelling and also the wild swans as it relates to this episode.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about The Magician, Season 4, Episode 10, called All That Hard, Glossy Armor. We were doing an episode recap and going over Margot's personal journey and her inner growth in this episode. Right now, we're going to talk some more about the Socratic method and how this story kind of parallels the wild swans in a way. So the Socratic method is kind of a person having a conversation with their soul or a student with a teacher in order to learn more about themselves. Socrates did not come up with the phrase, know thyself. That's actually inscribed on the Temple of Delphi, but he did expound upon that. And he said, knowledge is inherent in man, not outside. Wisdom is learning to recollect, more or less. So in this, Margot is questioning and challenging herself, even as she's also seeking the tools for Elliot's salvation, because as Socrates says, an unexamined life is not worth living. So they don't ever actually say it's the Socratic method in the episode. They don't lampshade that like they do with the hallucinations, but it very much is. So in these hallucinations, Margot is aware that they're hallucinations the whole time. She figures out very early on that because the monster is inhabiting Elliot's body and Elliot's up there singing and dancing, that it can't be the monster. So if it's not the monster, then it's not actually a corporeal Elliot, and it has to be a hallucination. And I like Margot's approach to this because she knows the hallucinations are manifestations of her mind, and she tells them to shut up. She's like, stop talking to me. You're me, and I run me, so cut it out. And at this point, she's also going out into the woods, out into the wild, because she's still just in the desert, and she's going out there to collect all of those grains of sand to forge these weapons. But it's taking her so long, and she feels like she's letting Elliot down, and Elliot as her best friend being manifesting as her inner self, this conversation she's having with her soul, which I think is very fitting for Elliot, is really starting to get to her because it's making her feel like she's failing him because she knows she has a finite amount of time to save him from this creature, and that every minute that goes by is another minute he is still in that creature's clutches, trapped in his own subconscious. So, Margot is supposed to be collecting these, and while she's collecting them, she's not supposed to display any emotions. Because according to the locals here, if a woman experiences and expresses any emotional distress, such as anger or sadness or grief, then the spirits rise up out of the sand and will take over their bodies and kill them. And the men jump in front of the women to have their bodies inhabited instead, because they say that a man is the only one strong enough to handle it. And still survive it. The guy with the axes essentially stabs these people in the chest with these axes. I guess it's more of a hacking motion. But he does that, and then they trap these spirits, or these demons, in a little glass jar, because they can't be killed, they can only be trapped. So Margot's told, hey, don't go out there and cry or get upset or anything, because then you're going to get possessed. And as she starts getting upset with herself about her frustrations with her father and her relationship with him, and how she felt she failed him, and how she feels that she's failing Elliot right now, she starts getting angry. And Elliot, as a component of her mind, is saying, hey, you need to calm down. You can't do this. You can't get angry right now. And she said, I am angry every second my eyes are open, because I know who I am and not what I pretend to be. So she is just trying to be hard to protect herself, and it just makes her angrier on the inside. Her coping mechanism isn't actually assuaging any of the grief from her relationship with her father, or the anger, or any of the pain. It's still in there. She's just covering it up. So this is also part of the mushroom samba trope, which is really interesting to me, because that trope is often used for comedic purposes, like in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, when Frank does acid and hallucinates a whole trip while in a trash can at a football game. The mushroom samba trope just means that someone has taken drugs and is now having actual hallucinations. But unlike It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, this one is used for character development and drama instead of comedy, which I think is something that really sets it apart narratively from most other uses of the mushroom samba trope. Regarding the women's emotions, Margot does totally lose it in her experience of trying to find this for Elliot and failing in her own eyes by just taking so long to find all of these little grains. And when she loses it, she really loses it, and she becomes so angry and frustrated and is yelling, and the spirits rise up out of the sand, and instead of possessing her, it presents itself to her. And she's not sure if it's because she has that fairy eye that allows her to see things that are magical, or whether she was just presenting herself to them because it did not immediately go into the man's body. But it takes the shape of a woman in a big red flowing gown floating above the ground. And Margot is confused, and she says, if you're a womanish thing, why do you do such crappy things to other women? And it starts talking to her telepathically and explains that when the spirits rise up out of the sand, they're doing that in response to women being upset. And they're there to do whatever it takes to help the women who are experiencing emotional distress. So if a man is causing that distress, then they jump into the man's body and go to deal with that in whatever way the woman needs. So if he were harming her, then she could go ahead and have the spirit kill him if she wanted to. And Margot at one point says, oh, you can make him do the dishes. Just anything, really. But the women can also order the spirits out of the bodies. So this plot line really correlates with Margot's own struggles about being too much for the one person who loved her above all others before she became her full self, and how women are deemed to be too emotional in many contexts in life. A lot of this is mirrored by the Wild Swans. Now, they do take a departure in how things are handled, but the Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen was one of my favorite fantasy stories as a small child, and I used to watch the movie. In the movie, Eliza's brothers They're all princes and princesses. Their mom has died, and their dad remarries. And he remarries a witch, unbeknownst to him. The witch gets really jealous of the kids, and so she goes out to their really nice treehouse out in the woods and turns them all into swans, but she's unable to turn Eliza into one. In the book, it's because Eliza has too much goodness in her, but in the movie, which is what we're going to follow, it's because Eliza just gets away, essentially. And then Eliza finds that she can turn her brothers back into humans if she spends about 7 years turning stinging nettles into yarn to knit these magical sweaters that they have to put on. And then once they put them on, then it should transform them back to boys. Now, the rest of the time, they can be boys, but only at night, and they turn back into swans with the rising sun. So once Eliza figures all of this out, she's been hanging out with them a little bit, but once she starts that task, she can't speak. She can't even cry out when the nettles sting her, because if she does, then the boys will not be able to turn back into humans. So she decides to take this vow of silence for years and goes about turning all these nettles into balls of yarn and then knitting those into sweaters. Eventually, a prince falls across her in the woods, and he decides she's beautiful and he wants to be with her. Very similar to how the Little Mermaid can't make any words. Eliza can't make words, but he still likes her anyway. Takes her back to the castle, decides he wants to marry her. But the witch comes along with her mom, who is also a witch, and finds Eliza there and tries to convince them that Eliza is a witch. So she gets accused of witchcraft, and they trick them by saying, hey, if she is not a witch, then she will speak up and say something. But if she doesn't, then that means she's a witch, because a witch can't tell you that they're not a witch. Very similar to how they did that in the Salem witch trials and everything, where they said, if she's a witch, she'll float. If not, she'll drown. And that just resulted in women being killed no matter what. As soon as they start to burn Eliza at the stake, the prince is very sad about this, but he's like, okay, I guess she's a witch, gonna have to burn her. She is still knitting the whole time as they're trying to put logs on the fire around her and start this fire. And as they begin to burn her, when they light the fire, she throws the sweaters up into the air for her brothers, who fly into them and become boys again, except her youngest brother, who had one sweater arm that wasn't finished. That was the last sweater she was working on. And so he turns back into a human, but he retains a single wing of a swan in place of an arm. Which, all things considered, all of her sweaters were almost burned along with her. So I guess, he can handle just having one swan wing for the rest of his life, I guess. And unlike Eliza, Margot does the one thing she was told she can't do. Eliza never expresses the emotional distress, but Margot does. So that's where they depart. They're both on this journey for their loved ones, these people they're very close to. And Margot just becomes so enraged in her frustration and unleashes it, only to find that the leaders of the local area had lied to her. And the spirit helps her complete her task. Because in her case, it wasn't a man who was causing her emotional distress. It was the inability to fill this bag full of black sand. And so the spirit goes ahead and fills the bag with black sand for her. And Margot takes it back to the local leaders, a man and a woman, only to find that they already knew that and they had been lying to her. So Margot knocks them both out when they try to attack her. She releases all the spirits that they've bottled up before and explains it to the other women. So in this way, Margot and that spirit help shut down the patriarchal oppression in that area by informing the local women and empowering them with the knowledge before she leaves. So I really enjoyed this telling of the heroic task plotline, where, similar to Hercules, you have to go and get all these things done before you can obtain your goal. I really enjoyed it. I liked how they told it via Margot. I like that Margot still considers herself to be King Margot, even though she had to give up her throne and have Finn overthrow her in order to save Elliot. And Margot would do anything to save Elliot. So even when she's hard, you don't forget that she does still love just as fiercely as she is sassy to everything else. And by the end of this, I think that in season 5, Margot might not be as hard as she was before. She's still Margot, but maybe without as much of that hard, glossy armor as a protective edge, because she's done apologizing for being who she is just because someone that she once loved really hurt her for being who she was. And I think that in that way it's very representative of people in like their 20s and 30s and getting comfortable with who you are, really. And it resonated with me a lot, and I thought that it might with you guys as well. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about Land of the Lost.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about Camp and the Magicians and how it parallels some of the story of the Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen, as well as a bit of the Socratic method within it. Right now, we're going to talk about Land of the Lost. I used to watch the original with my grandmother. It was a TV show. I think it came out in like 1976, I want to say. And it used to be on one of the old channels like TV Land or something when I was a kid. And I would watch that with her a lot. The original one was about a family who essentially get thrown back in time. And they meet I'm just going to say a hominid ancestor is essentially what he is. And his name is Chaka. And they call him, I think, an Australopithecine in the movie. But I'm not sure, I don't remember anymore if they actually gave him terminology back then. But the original was more Swiss Family Robinson than anything. But Swiss Family Robinson lost in time instead of just lost in space. So I really enjoyed the old one. It was a lot of fun. They had the Sleestaks, who were these giant lizard creatures who were actually rather intelligent and could walk on 2 legs and were very dangerous to the family, in addition to all of the other dangers that were out there, like, T-Rexes, hadrosaurs, etc. Now, the movie Land of the Lost with Will Ferrell, that one came out in 2009, and it is much more humorous and less dramatic. Well, it's still pretty dramatic, but it's less serious drama than the original Land of the Lost. And I really enjoyed this B-movie style take on it. This is definitely camp. It is so campy and hilarious. And it's a Thanksgiving tradition with my godson and my best friend, his mom, Janine, to watch this. We watch it every single Thanksgiving for the last 11 years. It's incredibly quotable, and it's so funny, and it holds up to repeat viewings. We laugh until we cry every single time. It's probably my favorite Will Ferrell movie, right up there with Step Brothers. Super underrated. So in this movie, Dr. Rick Marshall, played by Will Ferrell, has discovered how to travel through space-time using tachyon energy. And much like Daniel Jackson from Stargate, he gets laughed out of his field for it. Matt Lauer even ridicules him on the air. One person believes in him, though, Holly, who's a research assistant, And she is played by Anna Friel, who played Chuck in Pushing Up Daisies, if you also liked that work of speculative fiction. And Holly decides to go with him to an all but abandoned theme park in the desert where they go on what's essentially a gondola ride through a dilapidated theme park ride, like a water ride. And they're taken on this by a redneck survivalist type named Will, played by Danny McBride, who I absolutely love, especially in Tropic Thunder. So funny. So when they go on this ride, they get sucked into a vortex in the water when they turn on the tachyon amplifier, which is a backpack. And they get sucked into the vortex into the land of the lost. And when they get there, they get thrown like straight into the desert, and they see these Australopithecines, as Holly terms them, attacking another Australopithecine. And they try to scare them off, and the one that was being attacked, we find out his name is Chaka, and he joins them. And then shenanigans ensue. They run from a T-Rex, and Rick is just insulting the T-Rex the whole time. He's like, oh yeah, he has like a brain the size of a walnut. And then the T-Rex chucks a prehistoric walnut to where they're sitting on the other side of a canyon. And it's, almost as tall as Rick himself. And he's like, uh-oh, this is not good. So Rick decides that he's going to try to hide them from the dinosaur by covering his body in hadrosaur urine, which is something I have seen in other sci-fi movies that had dinosaurs in it. But in this case, it just burns his eyes, and no one else is going to join him in this, even though he stood underneath this hadrosaur for a long time trying to catch its urine in a jug. It's very ridiculous. And as time goes on, they get the tachyon amplifier stolen. They meet some more Sleestaks, and they think that one of them is good, and there is chicanery that ensues, and they should know that he's a bad guy because he's wearing a tunic. I mean, Prince Shizor, come on, that's how I knew he was a bad guy. He was wearing a tunic. And you have this tachyon amplifier on their backpack, and whenever it's turned on, it plays I Hope I Get It from Broadway's A Chorus Line, which is very funny. So the only time we hear Chaka speak English the entire time instead of his native tongue is when he is singing a line from I Hope I Get It, which is ridiculous. And he nails it with the accent and everything and is perfectly on key with singing it. It's hilarious. They also, like Margot, get high from a plant, although Chaka knew that would happen and just wasn't able to communicate it properly through Holly. So Holly is like, oh yeah, that'll be fine. And then she's like, oh wait, no, he just said that that's going to be really bad and you guys already drank it. So Holly has not drank it, just the guys, and they just get super high in this pool that's randomly been dumped into the middle of the land of the lost. Like, things from the Bermuda Triangle end up there. So there's planes and ice cream trucks and all kinds of random stuff that get zapped there. Once they get their backpack stolen from them by a pterodactyl or a pteranodon, I don't remember quite which, they have to go and get it. And the pteranodon has made its nest in a volcano, essentially, at the very top. And there are all these babies there, just all these eggs. So Rick goes to get it, but when he does, it stops playing the music from A Chorus Line and all the babies start to wake up. So he has to sing and dance that song. It is hilarious. Everyone should watch it. There's a Cher joke in there as well, Believing in Life After Love, where they're singing it into a crystalline structure, so it's vibrating like Cher's auto-tune. And it's so good. And when they first see the Sleestaks, Chaka starts yelling, Sleestaka, Sleestaka. And Will's like, are you saying chorizo tacos? Because I'm very hungry right now. And it's just very funny how they approach everything. The movie ends with a happy ending, though. And with validation for Will, he is able to restore his name in the scientific community and tells Matt Lauer he can suck it on air, and then just gets in a fist fight with Matt Lauer, which the whole thing is very funny, but extra so to me given Matt Lauer's involvement in the Me Too movement. They had no way of knowing that when they filmed it, but all of the dunking on Matt Lauer feels particularly poignant given his involvement in the Me Too movement. All right, we're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Afrofuturism.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
In our last segment, we were talking about camp in the movie Land of the Lost with Will Ferrell, Anna Friel, and Danny McBride. Up next, we are going to talk about Afrofuturism, and we're going to start with a definition of that and Janelle Monae's emotion picture, Dirty Computer. So the term Afrofuturism, if you're unfamiliar with it, was first coined by white author Mark Derry in his essay Black to the Future, which was a series of interviews that he conducted with black content creators. Afrofuturism pertains to a celebration of the black experience in the future, including imagining what art, science, and technology might look like through a black lens. Now, in Janelle Monae's emotion picture, Dirty Computer, so she's categorized it as what she calls an emotion picture, and it certainly does elicit emotions as you watch it. But the title of it is Dirty Computer, which is the name of the album. So it's Afrofuturism, it's a music video, but it's a music video and a visual album like Beyonce's Lemonade, where it's about 48 minutes long, and it is each of the music videos for the songs within the album stitched together by these narrative components in between. And in the visual album, Janelle Monae plays the main character named Jane, and they refer to her as Jane 57821. She's been labeled a dirty computer. And a dirty computer is someone who looks, thinks, believes, or behaves differently from the status quo as described by the folks in charge. Everyone is considered to be a computer, but folks who act different are considered to be dirty. So the dirty computers are rounded up and cleaned, quote unquote, using a machine called a Nevermind. And you're in this room where gas is inhaled while you're strapped to a table wearing a special helmet. The helmet sends your memories to the computer, where two people sit on the other side of the glass, two white men, and her memories are displayed as these music videos. They decide, these memories are dirty, and they wipe them from her mind as they go. So the computer's supposed to only pull dirty memories. And similar to bouts in history is this storytelling of showing her life beforehand and then her capture and her cleansing of these dirty thoughts and beliefs. So instead of an ethnic cleansing, this is more of a puritanical morality enforcement, similar to the morality police in areas of the Middle East, and also similar to a lot of events regarding Judeo-Christianity in history. Now, in the Nevermind chamber, the room is called the New Dawn, which is propaganda at its finest. The color has been sapped out of most things. The room is entirely white, the floors, the walls, everything. The table she's lying on is black. Her outfit is white. The other people there are adorned in white, including the people behind the glass and any other workers that you see there. And then they have metal gold in their hair and a strip of red. And there's a little bit of pinkish on the walls, and the doors are like blue. So for the most part, though, it's been completely sapped of color. Even the apples in the room are white. As the motion picture progresses, Mary Apple 53, aka Zen, who is played by Tessa Thompson, whom I love, is met by Jane, and you can tell that they're attracted to each other in these flashbacks told through her memories / the music videos. And in the music videos, you see, and some cutscenes, you see their relationship progress in the past, and the scenes in between stitch them together in the present. So she's also gaslighted as this goes along. They make her say her name, they make her repeat her name back to them, and that she's ready to be cleaned. At one point, after a couple of music videos, they turn Jane upside down, hanging her from the ceiling with tubes attached to her. And these tubes are leaching different vibrant colors from her body, just like they would blood. And these tubes are her creativity and the traits that make her unique, or as they see it, dirty. We see in the cutscenes and in the music video how she and her friends get captured. And it continues until we see Zen, Jane, and their male friend, Che, who appears to be a part of a polyamorous relationship with them, become captured. They all escape by working together to overcome their programming and leave the building. And throughout it, she has lyrics in there, like in Scrooge, she says, "Everything is sex, except sex, which is power. You know, power is just sex. Now ask yourself who's screwing you." And I really love that wordplay of making us think about sociocultural concepts, like everything is sex, except sex, which is power. And one of my favorite tweets I've ever seen was by someone named @BurialStan. And they said, when Janelle Monae said, "Everything is sex except sex, which is power," you can literally hear Foucault's wig flying out of his grave. So she's referring to Michel Foucault. And I love that that Janelle Monae weaves in elements of socioculture and also political commentary on our current world situation with racism, sexism, and LGBT issues, particularly with how these problems disproportionately affect people of color. And that is part of what makes it Afrofuturism. The whole time they're trying to wipe her mind, she's clinging to these elements of who she fundamentally is intersectionally. And I absolutely love it. She also makes references to the Greek play Lysistrata, where I'm not going to quote it precisely since this may be a family show, but she says they're going to start a certain type of riot or else put them on a diet, which is essentially what the women in Lysistrata do by, telling the men, hey, no more of that until you get it together and start treating people right, more or less. So there were all kinds of sociocultural references in there, including some to popular women of color, like Shonda Rhimes and Viola Davis, who each have made great strides for women of color in their respective fields. And they make some of the best content that I love to consume that's not sci-fi as well. They are amazing creators, and I love how Janelle Monae pays tribute to them in her songs as well. At one point, we see one of the two techs, who again are both white men, sitting on the other side of this glass, and one of them seems to be maybe newer than the other one and asks what they're viewing from her mind because it doesn't look like a memory at that point. He's like, this one doesn't look like a memory, and asks what it is, and then postulates that it might be a dream. But the other tech is like, it doesn't matter. He's like, just delete it. His attitude is totally blasé, and he doesn't have any curiosity or any sense of care or concern otherwise about what he's doing. He's just there following orders in a bored manner, going through the motions like so many who have participated in atrocities throughout history. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders have discussed how the ambivalence of many white people and other oppressors throughout history allowed for further oppression just through inaction, just through apathy. And if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. That is a Desmond Tutu quote. We also see that with the lions in The Lion King, where everything goes sideways with Pride Rock and the hyenas and Scar, and the predators really taking over the area, and the lions, who are really tasked with the domain of the area and all the creatures in the Pride Lands, just kind of lay down and submit instead of really fighting Scar in any way. And it doesn't matter whether or not we think that it's even a winnable fight. The fact that they just submit to it is what makes it problematic. The same can be said of the people on the rich gambling planet in Star Wars Episode 8. And it's really illustrating that the middle is always evil. There was an Ayn Rand quote that really struck home for me with this, and I'm going to read it to you guys real quick. There are two sides to every issue. One side is right and the other is wrong, but the middle is always evil. The man who is wrong still retains some respect for truth, if only by accepting the responsibility of choice. But the man in the middle is the knave who blanks out the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist, who is willing to sit out the course of any battle, willing to cash in on the blood of the innocent or to crawl on his belly to the guilty, who dispenses justice by condemning both the robber and the robbed to jail, who solves conflicts by ordering the thinker and the fool to meet each other halfway. In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. And any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. In that transfusion of blood which drains the good to feed the evil, the compromise is the transmitting rubber tube. So I really like how they illustrated this in the emotion picture with these different characters. You have a Mother Superior type character who is actively kind of being the Aunt Lydia of the situation and keeping everyone down and pressing everyone back down, even when they just go to raise their head a little bit. And similarly, the new guy, when he kind of raises his head a little bit, it's like, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing though? The other guy shuts him down. Not because he is necessarily caring about what's happening, but because he doesn't care at all. And then there are people like the new tech who might otherwise be allies, but they don't want to incur social stigma by not going with the flow. That's putting self-preservation above morality. And that's the new guy. You also see these types of characters played out in Jojo Rabbit, which came out earlier this year. And I also consider that speculative fiction, seeing as Jojo is hallucinating Hitler as his friend for most of the movie. And at one point in Jojo Rabbit, as Jojo and his mom, played by Scarlett Johansson, walk past a bunch of people hanging in the square who are fellow Germans, Jojo says, "What did they do?" And Scarlett Johansson says, "What they could." It was very poignant as well, and I loved that moment in the movie where she answered his question without really answering it in a way that he got at the time, but he certainly understood by the end of the movie. This whole storyline really reminds me of how slaves were made to convert to Christianity. It reminds me of the Spanish Inquisition. It also reminds me of syncretic religions such as voodoo, in which Judeo-Christianity was forced upon people of color who were brought here as slaves. And their gods, the Loa, have corresponding saints so that they could still worship without religious persecution, which is ironic since that's why white Europeans colonized the U.S. So Janelle Monae's emotion picture is outstanding in its storytelling. I absolutely love how she decided to tell it. And by the end, as we see that Jane still remembers Zen as Zen, even after they've put her through everything else, and Zen is supposed to have, Zen starts remembering who she is too, but she's like, oh no, it's too late. And then they both go in together and save Che. It also reminds me of what Kay said in Men in Black 2, which is, we are who we are even when we forget. I thought it was absolutely beautiful, and I thought that this was a great tie-in with Men in Black and how they talked about Jay going back into the past, and how because the past was so terrible for women and for people of color, that Afrofuturism really embraces going forward into the future and what that can look like in all of its brilliance through a Black lens. All right, we're going to go on another break. When we come back, we're going to talk some more about Afrofuturism, specifically mentioning Black Panther briefly, and also the clipping album Splendor and Misery.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about Afrofuturism and Janelle Monae's emotion picture Dirty Computer, which was a music video. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Afrofuturism with Black Panther and with Splendor and Misery, an album by Clipping. So the reason I'm bringing up Black Panther is just because I feel it's the most iconic one, the most iconic representation of Afrofuturism for people who are not yet really familiar with Afrofuturism. So if you still aren't quite with me as to what Afrofuturism is or what it looks like in media, think Black Panther. So in Black Panther, Wakanda is about the size of New Jersey, and it is in the middle of the African continent where it has been absolutely untouched by colonizers. And it has allowed the African people of Wakanda, the Wakandans, to really flourish and to really embrace themselves as being Wakandan and as being African as a whole. And it's really beautiful how they tell the story and how Shuri is the smartest person in the whole Marvel universe at this point. I love that she's a kid, but just like Peter Parker is able to be a white kid and have all of these powers, Shuri is just naturally smart. She is just a brilliant kid. She doesn't have superpowers other than she is just absolutely brilliant, and she's been able to thrive and embrace her blackness as well as her intellect and to create everything that T'Challa uses that helps make him effective as Black Panther. It's absolutely remarkable. So now that you have kind of a sense of Afrofuturism and how it requires not just a futuristic component, but a celebration of blackness in and of itself, we're going to talk a little bit about Splendor and Misery and how that focuses on the Black experience and what that could look like if the Civil War had gone a different way. So this album, Splendor and Misery, is by the band Clipping. Clipping includes Daveed Diggs, who you guys may be familiar with as portraying Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson in the Broadway production Hamilton. He is their vocalist for Clipping. There are also two white guys who are in the band who produce the music, named William Hudson and Jonathan Snipes, who are very talented. But today we're focusing more on Afrofuturism in general and the Black experience specifically. So we'll be talking more about Daveed Diggs' experience and just specifically the album, Splendor and Misery. Now, the awesome thing about Splendor and Misery is that it was nominated for a Hugo Award, which, as you may know, is sci-fi's greatest honor. And nominations are seldom bestowed upon musical displays of sci-fi. There isn't even an album category for it per se. And so when Splendor and Misery was nominated in, I believe, 2017, it went up against Game of Thrones and Doctor Who, which is crazy. Now, they did ask Clipping whether they thought that there should be a musical category for it. And they said no, because they don't think that there's really enough sci-fi albums that come out each year to warrant nominating 5, or enough to even nominate 5. And then if you did that, then you would just have like a lot of metal band nominations that were closer to fantasy with, people riding dragons and stuff like that, which I think is also fine. But since Hugo tends to, not be geared towards music anyway, I get where they're coming from. But I would be interested to see that more in the future, especially as more artists such as Janelle Monae emerge and give us these amazing Afrofuturistic works of art. So Daveed Diggs, days before he was supposed to move to New York to work on Hamilton, he was pulled off of his bike and thrown up against a fence by police for fitting a description. He was pulled over 36 times in a 3-year period while he was in his 20s. That is literally averaging once per month. That's crazy, but that is the experience of a lot of people of color. Police stops can be a terrifying experience for people of color, and Daveed really goes in depth about that in one of his interviews. He also draws upon his personal experience as a black man and the overall historical black experience in America in his album Splendor and Misery that he co-authored with Hudson and Snipes. So in Splendor and Misery, a slave named 2331 is floating through space in a ship, and the lyrics tend to usually come from 2331's experience or from the computer's perspective. He's floating in the ship, he's a mutineer, and so the ship is pretty much empty at this point, and he's floating through space trying to get to somewhere that has a civilization he can return to in some manner. He does not want to go back to a slave civilization, which makes sense. But he wants to find some civilization with other beings that he can join. So as he does this, they weave slave songs, historical slave songs, throughout the story with a sci-fi spin, in addition to Daveed's brand new songs that he wrote specifically for this album. So the guys wrote the music for it and the instrumentals, and they also kind of provided a loose story frame for it, and Daveed wrote all the lyrics. And they are outstanding. At one point, he says, "You could trip sets, real players trip light years." They pay homage to many different people of color who have strongly influenced sci-fi throughout the years, including one of the most well-known, Octavia Butler. And this is really about slavery in terms of time and how human lifespans are treated as a resource. They also go into a little bit about inherited trauma. So there is a theory that states that trauma can be passed down genetically, that those stressors can be passed down genetically. And they talk about that a little bit in this as well. The story ends with 2331 putting himself back into a cryosleep after setting the computer to jump through space until it finds a civilization that he can return to. And he goes back to sleep knowing that he might never wake up again, that he may not find it in his lifetime, but at least his human lifespan is no longer being treated as a resource. It's a very well-constructed album for both the storyline and for the music itself. It's very industrial, think, prog rock too, because they use some modulator sounds in it, and it really sounds like you are in the machinery and the vacuum of space. So in addition to the Afrofuturistic component, specifically, the sci-fi of it is amazing, and that's why it was nominated for that Hugo Award. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about my top 5 favorite camp shows.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about Afrofuturism and Black Panther and the clipping album Splendor and Misery. Now we're going to talk a little bit about my favorite camp shows. So, of course, The Magicians is up there at the top of the list. I already mentioned that earlier, that it's one of my favorites. I've watched it several times, and I have especially watched the scene of Elliot singing Don't Get Me Wrong while Margot is tripping on Lizard in the middle of the desert several times. The entire show, although campy, carries a lot of the sociocultural messages that I love so much in sci-fi. So even though I tend to be more sci-fi focused than fantasy or horror in my speculative fiction, personally, I really love The Magicians. It hits all the right notes for me with the sociocultural commentary in the same way that Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman, even though it's a Western, and I don't really like Westerns, is similar to Star Trek in that same way, where each of the episodes really has a message. I really also love in The Magicians how ridiculous and sometimes foul-mouthed they can be, because a lot of sci-fi is made for main networks, and so since it's on primetime television, they have to keep it pretty clean. But in The Magicians, they will go off, they do gritty storylines that aren't gritty just for the sake of grit. They're not getting fridged, they're very careful about that, they're very cognizant of it. And if something like that might happen, then they will hang a lampshade on it. They will outright call it out on the show. So I very much enjoy that aspect. I also enjoy how they explain how magic works, where it comes from, and the fact that it can be turned on or off in this scenario, and how people come up with technology to store magic in order to use it once the wellspring has been depleted. It's very sci-fi in a lot of aspects, even while it is fantasy in speculative fiction. Highly recommend that you guys check it out. It's camp, not cheesy, so if you think that it's silly, that's because it's supposed to be. But it's also a really excellent narrative device, and like lycanthropy in it is a sexually transmitted disease. It's very interesting how they do it, and they have some great guest stars like Felicia Day, etc. So definitely check it out. If you liked Once Upon a Time, they have some characters from that show in there as well. Not the characters, sorry, the actors. That would be really weird if they decided to cross over those two shows. Santa Clarita Diet is another of my favorites. I love that show on Netflix. Sad it was canceled, but on the other hand, I also think that the direction they were taking it in, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much anyway, just because of how I liked the character interactions, and the final season changes that in a way that would fundamentally affect those character interactions. Not going to spoil it for you, but if you liked The Addams Family, you might like the Santa Clarita Diet. It's about a mom who gets turned into a zombie in the first 10 minutes of the first episode. I'm not spoiling anything there. And how her husband and her daughter deal with that as she transitions, and also how she deals with it. So much like how the Addams Family is kooky and spooky and quirky, Santa Clarita Diet also is. But fundamentally, both of those shows, much like The Munsters, are about family. And I think it's absolutely beautiful how much Joel loves his wife, and how their daughter is, she's acting out at school. She's trying to just figure out how to be a teenager in general, but also how to do it in this world where her mom is a zombie. And I love their next door neighbor, Eric. Eric is one of my favorite characters. He's a big nerd who knows a lot about zombification. And so Eric is trying to help them out. His interactions with Joel really make me smile, and they're so wholesome. It is adorable. I love wholesome masculinity, as I've mentioned before, and if you do too, definitely check out Santa Clarita Diet. They also have great guest stars such as Portia de Rossi and Nathan Fillion. So if you enjoyed Firefly or Ally McBeal or Arrested Development, give it a shot. Another one of my favorites is Scream Queens. So that one's also off the air. It had Emma Roberts and Billy Lord in it and was so funny. Leah Michele from Glee was also in it, and that is because the same people who made Glee also made Scream Queens and American Horror Story, and I believe also American Crime. So you'll see a bunch of those actors throughout all the different shows. And I love how Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk reuse those actors in different ways. So they already have good working relationships with these people, and if you could go to work with your friends, I mean, I would. So they do a fantastic job, and they all work very well together. And the way that they tell the story is just so campy, and it's a horror show, and each season has a different setting. So you start at like a college campus, and it does the whole scary college campus plot line, and then, you know, they're at a hospital and are becoming nurses and stuff. It's all very ridiculous and over the top. Kirstie Alley is in one of the seasons, and so is John Stamos. And it's really fun to see them have so much fun with how ridiculous they make these scenarios. Niecy Nash is brilliant in it as well. Highly recommend it. Sabrina, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Not Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but also I love Sabrina the Teenage Witch. The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is also kind of campy, and I love it. I've watched a lot of those episodes multiple times, and it's easy to get friends who are not necessarily into either camp or sci-fi adjacent films, speculative fiction in general, to watch Sabrina. Because Sabrina is similar to Riverdale in a lot of ways. I like the new Riverdale as well, where everything is creepy and spooky. And in Sabrina, you know, she is just going through trying to be a teenager, also trying to figure out how to be a witch. And this takes a much darker tone than Sabrina the Teenage Witch did. It's very grim. Salem doesn't talk, which on the one hand I'm bummed about because I loved Salem, but on the other hand it would not have fit in well here, so I like how they went through that. This is based on a comic book series as well, so if you think you would prefer the comics, then by all means, go for it. But Kiernan Shipka is in it, as well as Miranda Otto, who you may remember as playing Éowyn in Lord of the Rings. I really enjoyed it. I think that it's very funny, and I love the different storylines, especially the ones related to family and these characters kind of coming into their own. There is substantive character development. There's a lot of diversity in the show as well. If that's your bag, go ahead and check that one out. Lastly, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So Buffy was very, very campy in the original movie with Donald Sutherland. I really enjoyed that. It was very silly and funny. It's still campy when Joss Whedon made it into a TV show, but it's a little bit less so. It's a little bit more serious in a lot of areas, and it deals with, you know, some really rough material. One of the first things that ever made me cry watching television, only 3 things ever have, was when Buffy has to kill Angel. And that broke my heart when they just zoom in on David Boreanaz's face and Buffy is just sobbing and Angel just like looks so sad, but you can see that he finally recognizes her again after becoming Angelus for so long. Oh, oof, my heart, you guys. It's so rough. I'm sure most of us have seen it at this point. I didn't give you guys a spoiler warning for that one because, you know, Buffy came out in 1997, so it ran concurrently with The X-Files and Stargate SG-1. It's been off the air for a while, and that happens in, like, season 2. But it's very good. It's campy in a lot of ways, and it's very funny. And as a homeschooled kid, I really loved when Buffy was trying to convince Joyce, her mom, to homeschool her. And she's like, Mom, just homeschool me. It's not just for crazy religious people anymore. So that is like a personal thing for me. But I really enjoyed that show a lot. I enjoyed Allison Hannigan's whole character arc as Willow was fantastic. You can see Seth Green in there from his early career, as well as Michelle Trachtenberg, who was in Inspector Gadget as well. So overall, those are my top 5: Magicians, Santa Clarita Diet, Scream Queen, Sabrina, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you also like camp, I encourage you to check those out, or if any of those descriptions piqued your interest, check them out. If you have more ideas or your own favorite shows or books or comics or even music that you would consider to be sci-fi or sci-fi adjacent, anything in speculative fiction, go ahead and hit me up on social media. Hit me up at the GSMC Sci-Fi Twitter page or Facebook page and tell me about what your favorite is. If I haven't seen it before, I will definitely go check it out and might even feature it on a future podcast. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you remember to please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.